The moment you finally walked away, everything you had been trying to understand suddenly became clear, not because of something they said, not because of a moment you planned or a decision you announced out loud. It happened in the quiet, in the space between one unanswered message and the next. In a moment when you were sitting somewhere alone and you thought, "I cannot keep doing this." That thought wasn't dramatic, it wasn't angry, it was tired. A very specific kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad day or a rough week. It comes from months of giving energy to something that never fully gave it back. And in that tiredness, something inside you finally made a choice, the one you had been postponing for far too long. This is not a story about winning someone back. It's not about tactics or mind games. What we're going to talk about today is what actually happens below the surface, emotionally and psychologically, when a person who has been carrying an unequal dynamic sets it down and walks away. Because what gets revealed in that silence is more honest than anything that came before it. Part 1. You were the only one running. The truth is, you didn't arrive at this moment quickly. There was no single day when you woke up and decided you were done. That's not how it really works. What actually happened is that you ran for a long time, weeks, months, maybe longer, before your legs finally gave out. You were always the one initiating, every time. The one who sent the first message when silence stretched too long. The one who softened the tension after disagreements, who followed up when plans fell through. You who made sure the connection stayed alive by consistently feeding it your attention and your energy. You told yourself that was just who you are, someone who cares, someone who values closeness, someone who believes that a relationship is worth working for. And in many ways, that was true. But somewhere between genuine care and what this became, something shifted. Care stopped being freely given and started being anxiously managed. You weren't just showing up for them anymore. You were maintaining the connection the way you'd maintain something that would fall apart the moment you stopped holding it together. And so you kept going. You kept filling every silence before it grew too heavy. You adjusted your tone to match their mood. You reread messages before sending them to make sure you didn't ask for too much. You celebrated their wins and quietly absorbed their difficult moods without saying a word about how much of that you were holding, and all the while something underneath was slowly cracking. Not in a way anyone around you would notice, not in a way you'd easily describe to someone else, but inside, you were gradually losing the version of yourself that had existed before this dynamic started. The version that felt secure enough in relationships not to monitor every response. The version that didn't analyze silence for meaning. The version that gave energy freely because it felt good, not because it felt necessary. You started to feel invisible, not because you weren't present. You were more present than anyone, but because being so completely consistently present had somehow caused you to fade. The more you gave, the less it seemed to register. The more effort you put in, the more natural it became for them to receive without reciprocating. You had quietly taught them not to try as hard because you were always there to cover the gap before anyone noticed it. And then, without a speech, without a confrontation, without any of the clarity you might have expected, a thought arrived. It didn't come loudly. It arrived the way quiet truths do, softly, almost apologetically, and it said, "You should not have to work this hard just to feel like you matter to someone." That thought was the beginning of everything. Part 2. When your silence starts speaking. When you first pulled back, the silence probably felt uncomfortable, almost wrong. You had been so conditioned to filling every gap, to keeping things moving, that allowing space to exist felt like negligence, like you were letting something important slip. And for a while, the silence confirmed your deepest fear. No message asking if you were okay, no sign that anything had changed for them. just emptiness where your effort used to be, and that hollowness felt, for a moment, like evidence that you had never mattered as much as you believed. But here's what most people miss about that moment. What you were experiencing in that silence was not absence. It was truth, not a new truth. An old one that had been quietly present all along, covered up by the constant motion of your effort. The moment you stopped filling every space, the actual structure of the dynamic became visible. And what was there, what had always been there, was asymmetry, real, undeniable asymmetry. There is a psychological principle at play here that matters enormously. When one person consistently overfunctions in a relationship, the other person underfunctions by default. Not always out of carelessness, sometimes simply because the system has been set up to allow it. Your constant reaching out meant they never had to reach out first. Your attention meant they never had to seek it. Your presence removed the natural friction that would have required them to show up with their own effort. So when you stopped, when you introduced real, sustained space, you didn't just change the dynamic. You disrupted the entire system. The invisible rules shifted, and they could feel it, even if they couldn't name what they were feeling yet. Your silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything you had previously been doing that they had unconsciously come to expect. And now that it was absent, it left a shape, an outline they could finally perceive, because it was no longer being filled. And that shape was the truth. Part 3. They begin to feel what you felt they noticed. Not immediately, probably not the first day, maybe not even the first week, but they noticed. At first, they told themselves it was nothing, that you were just busy, that you'd had a long few days, that the distance would resolve itself the way it always had before, because you always came back. You were the constant, the reliable one, the person who showed up without being asked. In their model of the relationship, the dynamic always corrected itself because you corrected it. But this time, the correction didn't come. And as the days passed, something they hadn't anticipated began to grow. A low-grade, almost unnameable unease. A sense that the texture of things had shifted, that some quality of the connection they had been taking for granted, some warmth, some presence, some background hum of being attended to, was no longer there. Consider what is happening psychologically in this moment. For a long time, they had experienced your effort as a constant, the way we experience the hum of electricity or the warmth of a room. We don't consciously register these things until they disappear. We don't understand how much they were contributing to our comfort until the lights go out and the room goes cold. Your presence had been exactly that, something so reliable it had stopped registering as valuable. It had become the assumed, the default, the given, and now in its absence they were starting to hear it. They were reaching for their phone and noticing your name wasn't there, moving through their day and encountering moments that carried a familiar wrongness, a quiet incompleteness they couldn't immediately place. What people take for granted always speaks the loudest in its absence. And here's what that absence started doing. It made them remember. Not with nostalgia at first, more like trying to reconstruct something they hadn't thought to observe while it was happening. The way you used to check in, the way you smoothed things over, the way you stayed when staying required something from you. Those things had seemed ordinary while they were occurring. Now, through the lens of their disappearance, they were beginning to look like what they actually were. Choices. Consistent, intentional choices. And that realization could not have been delivered through any conversation you might have had. No argument, no ultimatum, no carefully worded explanation could have taught it. Only the experience of your absence was capable of making that point. And it was making it now, quietly and undeniably. Part 4. The weight of regret. Regret doesn't come all at once. It seeps in through the texture of ordinary moments. It arrives when something happens, something small or meaningful or funny, and the first person they want to tell is you. Then comes the memory that things are different now. It arrives on a slow evening when their phone is quiet in a way that feels heavier than it should. It arrives in the gradual, reluctant realization that something genuinely valuable was present before and that it is now absent. Not because it was taken, but because it was never honored. And what makes this variety of regret different from ordinary disappointment is that it cannot be argued away. It cannot be resolved intellectually because it isn't coming from logic. It's coming from feeling the specific shape of something that is no longer there, feeling the gap that your presence used to fill. They begin to look backward and see things differently. The times you stayed when they were difficult, the times you reached out despite having reason not to, the times you gave generously and without keeping any visible score. Those moments didn't look exceptional when they were happening. They looked like the normal way of things. But perspective shifts in absence, and now those same moments look like what they actually were, evidence of someone who had decided over and over again to invest in this connection, to choose it, to show up for it. Walking away quietly communicates what no argument could ever finish saying, and that understanding lands in a way that nothing you could have said would have achieved. Because you didn't say it, you showed it, through the silence of your absence and the clarity of what was no longer there. But here is the part that matters most for you. By the time that understanding arrives in them, by the time the regret becomes real and the realization finally lands, you are already somewhere else, not physically, emotionally. Because the work you've been doing quietly in the days and weeks since you stopped, the reclaiming of your attention, your peace, your sense of self, that work does not wait for anyone's realization. It happens on its own timeline, at its own pace, which means when they finally understand what they lost, you are no longer standing at the entrance, waiting for the moment to arrive. You have already moved. And that movement, that quiet, unhurried forward movement, is the most important thing that changed. Part 5. What you reclaim when you stop. Let's talk about what this actually looked like for you on the inside. Because the story isn't only about what changed in them. The more important story, the one that matters longer, is what began to come back to you. When you stopped chasing, you got your mind back. But think honestly about the volume of cognitive and emotional energy that had been going into this one dynamic. The replaying of conversations trying to find where things went wrong. The careful reading of every response for clues about where you stood. The anticipation, the preparation, the management of your own feelings so they wouldn't become inconvenient to someone who wasn't doing the same for you. That is an enormous amount of mental real estate. And now it belongs to you again. All of it. And what you choose to do with that reclaimed space is the real invitation of this transition. Because stopping the chase isn't simply an ending. It is, in the most literal sense, an opening. Space where something new can breathe. Where you can begin to remember not just who you are without this particular weight, but who you have always been capable of being when your energy isn't being poured into something that cannot hold it. You start noticing things. A morning that feels lighter than any in recent memory. A conversation that flows naturally without monitoring. A moment when you catch yourself simply present, not calculating, not waiting, not managing, and you realize that presence has been absent from your own life for a very long time. These are not small things. These are signs of a self in the process of returning. And something deserves to be said plainly here. You were never too much. You were never unreasonable for wanting reciprocity. You were never wrong for showing up fully. What you were, what you are, is a person whose capacity for genuine investment exceeded what that particular dynamic was structured to receive. And that is information about the dynamic. It is not information about your worth. The moment you stopped chasing was not weakness, dressing itself up as strength. It was the real thing. Genuine strength that had simply run out of reasons to keep performing as though it were weakness. It was you deciding quietly and without ceremony that your effort has value, that your attention is not an unlimited resource to be spent without return, that the people in your life should rise to meet you, not simply wait for you to reach them everywhere, always, at whatever cost. And if someone in your life is only now beginning to understand the weight of what they didn't honor, that realization is entirely theirs to sit with. It doesn't require your explanation. It doesn't need your response. It doesn't need you to soften it or meet them halfway. Because by the time that understanding arrives, you have already done the harder work. You have already healed. You have already learned what it feels like to exist without the low-grade weight of a one-sided dynamic. And that feeling, that lightness, that clarity is not something you'll trade away easily again. Their realization comes after your growth, after your decision, after you already figured out how to be whole. That means it doesn't define you anymore. The clarity you found belongs entirely to you. If something in this video landed somewhere real, take a moment to like it. It genuinely helps PsycheVision reach the people who need to hear this. And leave a comment below. What changed in your life the moment you finally chose yourself over the chase? Because sometimes the quietest decision carries the loudest truth. And the moment you stop running after something that was never running toward you, that is when everything finally begins to change.